in language arts and social studies. And I want you to do a few things while you watch this. So if you don't have a pencil and a paper, it can be anything like a scrap piece of paper, pencil, pen, marker, whatever. Go pause the video right now and go grab one. Okay, so we this week are talking about racism and slavery, and the two are super connected. And your goal this week is to figure out what is that connection. How does racism relate to slavery? And they have a very direct relation. What I want you to do on your piece of paper is I'm going to give you a direction, and then I'm going to have you pause the video, do it, and then unpause the video. Okay, so on your paper, knowing we're going to define racism as the belief that one race is superior or better than another. I want you to write down on your paper any examples of racism you've seen either in your own life, in the lives of your friends or family, or even depicted on TV, on the news, movies. Go ahead, pause right now and write down any examples of racism, one race believing they are better than the other, on your paper now. Okay, now I want you to look back at that list that you just made, and I want you to be thinking about that as we're talking, because as we talk about slavery, it's really hard to think about like how that would ever happen, how that could ever have just been the way things are and totally accepted. But really, for much of America's history, the belief that one race is better than the other, racism, has been a huge, deeply embedded part of our history. So before we really start to jump in, I want you to, just like when we're in the classroom, just be sensitive and think about what your own experiences are. You may not have experienced any racism. There may be other people in our classroom who have. So I just want you to make sure that you're just consistently checking yourself and being sensitive and respectful as we're looking into these topics. So this week you are going to be looking at a DBQ, and there's some images. There's an image in there that's really hard to look at. It's also in your textbook. There's a poster for a slave auction. I want you to read that carefully and kind of think about what those words are really saying about what they believed about Black people, about African Americans. And lastly, on that DBQ, you're gonna see an argument for slavery. And I want you to look at that and just try to understand what he's saying, because people did argue for it, which is so crazy because we all know at this point it's wrong. It's not okay. But they had arguments for it. They had reasons they believed it was okay. And really, all of those reasons stem from racism. So as you're reading, I really want you to try to think about, okay, how does the idea that one race is better than the other really contribute to this perpetuation, this continuation of slavery? Because slavery was actually a part of our history, like I said, for a long time. So originally what was happening is Africans from Africa were literally stolen from the coastline of Africa. They would be captured, sometimes by competing tribes, sometimes just by explorers. They'd be captured, stuffed in, and I say stuffed on purpose because they were packed into these ships like they could barely move, and a lot of people died on the way over. Conditions were not good. They were not fed well. They were brought over to America. America wasn't the only place that was involved in the slave trade. It was also Central America and Europe as well for a while. But as we're talking about U.S. history, they were brought here and sold, and they were treated as if they were property. So it was not like, oh, you're another human that has to do stuff for me, but I'll give you like a good place to live. They were literally seen as property. So the same as a horse or a cow. So that idea really made it so, especially in the South, there was a lot of people who defended slavery. And I also want to point out a few things. So while slavery was illegal in the North for a lot of this time, and then as we began to add states, they made like a weird arbitrary line saying no slavery could exist above that line, but slavery could exist below. But just because there wasn't slavery doesn't mean that racism didn't exist. So a lot of free Africans, a lot of free Black people realized that in the North, they were still treated with a lot of racism. They were treated like they were less than the white people around them. So I don't want to paint this picture like the South was evil and the North was good. Like everybody in the history of the United States, I mean, there were individuals who fought against it, but overall there was this deep-rooted racism. And that's kind of the point that we're getting at. But I do want you to also start thinking there were definitely differences between the North and the South, which is really important because we're getting close to, we're going to start talking about causes of the Civil War next week, and then the Civil War, and then what happened after the Civil War. So that's kind of the remainder of the year. And we have started talking about differences in the North and the South from the very beginning of the year. So I'm going to have you guys recall back, and I want you to pause right now. Try to write down right after, pause and write this down. What are differences that you can remember between the North and the South that we talked about earlier this year? Go ahead and pause right now and then resume after you've written a few things down. Okay, so hopefully you remembered something, but if you didn't, I don't blame you. It's been a long time. I want you to think back to when people first even landed, first came to the United States. There were some differences between the North and the South, just in its geography. So if you remember, the South had really good soil, which means that they could grow lots of crops. The North had that rocky soil. They had to hunt and gather and trade for their food and to stay alive. So you had a really distinct difference. And if you have the ability to grow a lot of crops in one area, then you need people to help you maintain those crops. So that's why in the South, we really see an explosion of slavery down there, because they needed labor and they didn't want to pay for it. So they got slaves instead. In the North, slavery wasn't as much of a thing because they really didn't have these huge plantations that they had to maintain. They had more like small farms, and they did a lot of trading and hunting and gathering. And then moving forward, still because of those differences from the very beginning, we see cities being built in the North, and in the South, we still see lots and lots of farmland. So there's all these different desires for the North and the South. Even like taxes are different. We talked about that when we were talking about the Revolutionary War, the causes, right? So the North really, the people in the cities, they did not like those higher taxes because they had to get all of their stuff from other people. The South weren't as affected by it because they were selling most of their stuff. So I just want you to be thinking like there's lots of differences. It goes really deep, but ultimately the biggest the biggest thing we're going to come to when there's a huge divide is this issue of slavery and whether or not slavery should be legal, because people started to come around to this idea of, wait a minute, these are other humans, not property. But that was it took a long time to get there. So this week, I just want to remind you of a couple of things that we've talked about. I want you to remember that this is a tough issue and it still affects us today. We still see racism. We still see the effects of slavery. And secondly, I want you to start looking at the differences between the North and the South and how they interacted with slavery and racism. And because it's going to come to a head here in a little bit when we're talking about the Civil War. And I want you to really, this week, you're really focusing on what's the connection between racism, believing one race is superior to another, and slavery. How did those two connect? And that's really what you're writing about in your DBQ. Feel free to send me an email or come to office hours if you have questions. Remember, office hours are 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock every day. You can live chat, you can email, or you can phone call. But if you live chat, remember to bring a friend with you.